Hello and welcome to another episode of Smart Freight Conversations, where we share interesting and important information and updates about freight decarbonization and the drive towards a zero emissions logistics industry. I'm Andy Golding. I'm the head of Academy here at Smart Freight Center, and I'm your host for today. Today we're talking about LETS in aviation. That's Low Emission Transport Services. What they are, claiming reductions through LETS, and managing them. Joining me for this conversation is our Chief Development Officer here at Smart Freight Center, Andrea Schoen. We have two Andreas on the couch today, actually. So, Andrea, wonderful to have you here. Let's dive into today's episode.
Happily. Hello to everybody.
So let's start by setting the stage for LETS in aviation. What do we mean by low emission transport services, and how is the concept applied specifically in aviation?
Right, before we talk of LETS, low emission transport services, I think we should start to talk about transport services. The ordinary fossil ones, what are they? So you ship a cargo from A to B, and it transits perhaps several times. Today we are focusing on the leg for aviation, the air freight. Okay. And it carries with it, let's say, a rucksack of fuel burn along that way, end to end. And this rucksack is filling up with each mile traveling. And also depending on the vehicle it is in. Is it a large vehicle? Is it a road vehicle? Is it an aircraft, large aircraft, small aircraft? That all impacts the rucksack, the carbon footprint of this shipment. So this is the ordinary transport service.
Got you.
Now, talking about the low emission transport service is then derived therefrom, instead of a fossil rucksack, you have a much lighter rucksack, because there are green fuels in it, or not directly in it, but we come to that later. It's rather the attributes of lower fuels that this shipment is carrying all the way through a transport. In this case, the aviation legs that we are focusing on.
I really love that analogy of the rucksack that this good is traveling with, because I think that it makes it so clear of where we're assigning what is this fuel burn and what is the actual footprint of moving one good from place to place. So now that we understand what a transport service is, how do we apply low emission transport services to aviation?
So where to start actually? Usually it's the airline itself that offers such low emission transport service. For simplification, let's just go through that chain. And of course, it needs to then somewhere get low emission fuels. In aviation, this is Sustainable Aviation Fuel, SAF, that's the short, the abbreviation of it. So an airline obtains this fuel and uplifts the fuel somewhere. We come to that later, direct and indirect, to specify how the flow is then in practice. But in its operational service, it incorporates this fuel. And as it is an owner of it, it can sell it to its transport purchasers on a shipment by shipment level. And you already imagine if you burn it in an aircraft, but you then have to break it down to shipment level, you need, of course, additional information to do so, right? But for the one who purchases it, he receives fractions of this new or better fuel that is only and solely allocated, attributed to his specific shipment or shipments on specified lanes where the previous transport service, which was solely fossil, is now green. or backed by sustainable aviation fuel.
Okay, so could you give me an example of, let's say I have ordered a pair of sneakers and my pair of sneakers is one of 10 shipments on this airplane, but the company shipping my sneakers decides that they want to purchase sustainable aviation fuel for their shipment.
Yeah, let's do the ordinary purchase way. When I go to an airline, I'm a B2B customer. I'm not coming from the single user that wants to have his shoes covered by sustainable aviation fuel. That's, so to say, the end of the chain. So let's come from the middleman to whom an airline usually is selling. So let's say I'm a transport service provider and I purchase from an airline a certain amount of shipments that I do for Nike or anyone who is then selling the shoes. And then I check with Nike, with this shoe purchaser, what is the amount of shipments of his shoes that he wants to be covered by SAF. And he would tell me then, oh, I have 100,000 customers who would like to have these shoes. And then you translate that back to the airline and say 100,000 shoes, that translates into 100,000 packages, shipments, whatsoever. These should be covered by sustainable aviation fuels. And then the airline needs to recheck what is actually the weight, the total weight of these shoes, including their packaging, to which these amounts of fuels are attributed to. And then you can break it down even to the single shoe, but that's at the very end of the chain.
Okay, thank you. That creates a nice, clear picture of how we're attributing it to a single product. So with that in mind, and obviously this is a really important mechanism because it creates access to low emission services and low emission fuels that might not be available where this particular provider is operating. So we can still make a difference, make an impact, and lower our emissions, even if it's just somewhat decentralized or decoupled. But this would obviously come with the requirement for integrity measures, credibility. So from your experience in working with aviation stakeholders, what are some of the key steps to creating credible, high integrity LETs, especially when using SAF?
So in the very first place, you need what you call a proof of sustainability. And this proof of sustainability shows you the environmental attributes of the fuel and that the fuel has not been purchased to somewhere else or someone else and is not used for a mandate, right? There is the integrity of additionality and avoiding double counting this way. So once you have that proof of sustainability, the airline has it in its ownership. And although the airline cannot transfer it along the chain, it can be inbuilt in the documentation so that an auditor sees the airline owns the fuel. Yeah. So you need to have that kind of supervision or audit that the fuel is in the ownership of the airline, wherever it's purchased. Now, in the next step, as said, the fuel needs to be attributed to the shipments, and an airline needs to give a list of shipments that are backed by this fuel, right? Especially when the selection of the shipments are already done by either the shipper or the forwarder, who want a certain amount of shipments covered by sustainable aviation fuel. So this list of transport needs to be clearly given with the respective carbon footprint. And the carbon footprint changes with the amount of sustainable aviation fuel that is attributed to these shipments. So it could be, the 1,000 tons or 10,000 tons or whatever. And then the carbon footprint changes respectively, what we call the carbon intensity, meaning rucksack, the weight, the emission weight per ton kilometer. Why is that important? It is important that although the fuel itself has a certain reduction implication, because when you change fossil fuel by a sustainable aviation fuel, you save, so to say, roughly 3 kilos per kilo of fuel. However, you cannot just deduct it from your end carbon footprint. You need to follow this fuel impact along the actual fuel need of your shipment. And this is something that sounds super complicated, but for the ones that are doing carbon accounting along end-to-end transports, it's only actually a change of fuel quality.
Okay.
Right? So usually they account with a fossil fuel, have a list of shipments from A to B, have the transport activity in terms of ton kilometers, and instead of having then the fossil emission factor, they will receive the emission factor from the proof of sustainability of the sustainable aviation fuel, which is much lower and shows them then the impact for their shipments. And high integrity means that someone is actually looking at this transaction and that the documentation of each step is there.
So based on everything that you've just shared, and there's a very strong note of credibility and integrity that is required to make this work, because this is an incredibly important mechanism, as I said before, of helping us raise the bar. So we have access to sustainable aviation fuel for the sake of the conversation we're having today. Maybe not directly where we're operating, but we can still make a difference. So making that difference, but making sure that we account for it and report for it credibly and with integrity is critical. And how can companies, whether it's carriers or forwarders, ensure that the LETS data is safely recorded, it's traceable, and that it's protected against double counting?
Right, you need a respective registry that captures every step in the chain of custody, as we call it. So captures the data from the proof of sustainability of the fuel, captures the transition to the scope 1 airline picking it up and uplifting it, captures the transition then to the scope 3, what we call the scope 3 purchaser, who passes it on either to a shipper or to the end customer. Every step needs to be registered with respective documentation. And of course, as there are many different registries, the interoperability of these registries needs to be secured. Alternatively, you can do that yourself between the players, from the fuel provider over the airline and the forwarder and the shipper, do the handover in a multiple audit. That means every transition is audited with the respective documentation behind. And we have, with the MBM specification, a list of to-dos and documentation in place that an auditor, verification and validation body can apply. So if they are, so to say, certified by us, they can apply that in practice.
Okay, so registries and auditing are some of the biggest tools that we can use to make this work, because I think we can safely say that this market-based measures mechanism, it is still a developing story, but it's a powerful story. So what we need to do is make sure that while we're building it, while the story is developing, we're doing that with credibility, with integrity, and building something that is robust and will stand the test of time and the test of scrutiny as well. So we have a lot going on here at Smart Freight Centre with regards to market-based measures. And a final word maybe for a provider, whether a carrier or a forwarder, who's wanting to start integrating LETS more into their operations to help them decarbonize. What would be your if I come to you and I say, you know so much about this topic, where do I start? How do I what's the first step that I can take? What's your advice to me?
I would say pick the right people in a company that are already very familiar with carbon accounting. As I said previously, it's just exchanging the source of fuel or the type of fuel in the overall chain. So one needs to understand logistics and the whole transport chain and how it is accounted for rucksack-wise. And then you also know how to repack your rucksack, right? And if you are interested in building that into your own target, speak to your provider. It could be the forwarder, it could be the airline, and say, look, I want to have certain shipments converted into low emission transport. And you just define what you need and where you want to end up. And then it's on the service provider, the airline or the forwarder, to figure that out, right? You don't need to think. You get a result, and the result should, of course, match your investment strategy or your internal carbon pricing strategy. And then you are fine. So you don't need to go through all these nitty-gritty details that I'm just talking about. It's only the carbon accountant that needs to know that.
So your carbon accountant needs to go through the nitty-gritty details.
But he or she is used to it.
Absolutely. It's not foreign to them, it's comfortable to them. I love that analogy of this. All this is, it's about just repacking your rucksack.
Yeah.
And I think that takes something that can seem massively complex and just brings it down to its real core of pure simplicity of it. All we're doing here is repacking the rucksack differently.
Correct, yeah.
And finding the right people to help us do that.
That's it.
I think that's
as simple as that.
So simple. I think that's a brilliant place to leave today's conversation. Andrea, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. I've certainly learned a lot. The rucksack analogy is amazing. My brain absolutely loves it. If you want to know more, we have a lot of resources on the Smart Freight Center Academy. We have a whole library of educational media resources. We have trainings on aviation emissions accounting, trainings on book and claim. So come on over to the Smart Freight Center Academy and continue the conversation.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.